The locker room smelled faintly of detergent and metal, the kind of clean that never quite erased what came before it. And Marcus Reed stood in front of an open locker that was not really his yet, its hinges creaking softly as he placed a folded uniform shirt inside with careful precision, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if every inch of space mattered, as if order was something he could build with his hands even when everything else around him felt tilted. His reflection in the narrow mirror was cut by a thin scratch across the glass, splitting his face into two halves that did not quite line up. And for a moment he studied it, not out of vanity, but habit, the same quiet assessment he had carried since long before this precinct, long before the badge resting heavy against his chest, warm from his body heat, steady against the slow rhythm of his breathing. 8 years in service, 3 commendations, 1 quiet transfer that did not come with explanation, only a sealed envelope and a single line printed in formal language. Report to Precinct 47, effective immediately, and he had read it once, then again, not questioning the order, not needing to, because he already knew what places like this could hide beneath polished reports and clean statistics. Behind him, laughter rose and fell in short bursts, echoing off tiled walls, a story being told about a late-night call, exaggerated details, voices overlapping, but beneath it there was a current, subtle, consistent, like a hum that never quite stopped, and Marcus could feel it without turning around. The way conversations dipped just slightly when his name was mentioned, the way silence followed him by half a second longer than it should. He closed the locker gently, the click of the latch soft but final, then reached down to tighten the strap on his utility belt, checking each piece by instinct. Radio, cuffs, flashlight, each one aligned, each one where it belonged, not because anyone was watching, but because that was how he had always worked, controlled, prepared, steady. A voice from across the room called out, not loud, but clear enough. Hey Reed, you get lost finding your locker, or you just like standing there? A few snickers followed, quick, contained, and Marcus turned just enough to acknowledge the direction without fully facing them, his expression neutral. Composed. I found it, he said, voice even, measured, and that was all. No edge, no invitation, just a statement that settled into the room and then disappeared, leaving nothing for anyone to push against. He picked up his cap from the bench, brushed an invisible line of dust from the brim, and stepped out into the hallway where the air felt cooler, less crowded, the overhead lights stretching in a long row toward the front of the building. And as he walked, his footsteps quiet against the floor, he passed a bulletin board filled with notices, commendations, and faded photos of past captains, faces frozen in time, all of them watching without really seeing. And Marcus slowed for just a fraction of a second, eyes scanning the names, the dates, the gaps between them. Then he moved on, his pace unchanged, his shoulders relaxed, but his focus sharpened, because beneath the surface of routine, beneath the jokes and the glances and the easy dismissals, there was something else here. Something structured, something practiced, and Marcus Reed had not come to this place by accident. He had come because patterns always left traces, and he had learned a long time ago that the loudest rooms often tried the hardest to hide what mattered most. The precinct floor shifted subtly as the morning settled into rhythm, not louder, not busier, but more defined, like a machine clicking into its usual pattern, and Marcus Reed stood near the edge of the central desk cluster, one hand resting lightly against the cool metal surface as he reviewed a stack of printed incident reports that had been left slightly out of order. The pages misaligned just enough to suggest carelessness rather than chaos, and he straightened them without thinking, tapping the bottom edge twice until they formed a clean line. Across the room, Officer J. Collins leaned back in his chair, boots crossed at the ankle, speaking with Sergeant Miller in a tone that carried just far enough to be heard without being addressed, the kind of conversation meant to include everyone and no one at the same time. And every few seconds, a glance would flick toward Marcus, quick, measuring, followed by a half smile that never reached the eyes. The radio on the desk crackled again, dispatch calling in a minor disturbance 2 blocks south. Nothing urgent, just a noise complaint, but the response came slower than it should have, a pause hanging in the air before Jake reached for the receiver, his fingers tapping it once before lifting it. Unit 3, we will take it, he said, voice steady, controlled, and then he set it down with a soft click, not looking at Marcus as he added, "Rookie, you ride with me." The word landing flat, more label than instruction. Marcus nodded once, a small, contained motion, and reached for his cap, placing it on with a practiced adjustment. Brim aligned just right, his reflection briefly catching in the dark screen of a powered-down monitor nearby, a shadowed version of himself moving in sync. As they walked toward the exit, the hallway seemed to narrow again, not physically, but in the way attention followed them, conversations dipping just enough to mark their passing, and Marcus could feel the weight of it without turning, the unspoken boundaries, the lines already drawn before he had even arrived. Outside, the air carried a cool edge, early sunlight stretching long across the asphalt. The patrol car parked at an angle near the curb, its paint reflecting the pale blue of the sky in uneven patches, and Jake moved ahead without waiting, unlocking the driver's side with a quick motion, then pausing just long enough to glance over the roof. "Passenger side," he said, not unkindly, but not offering anything more either. Marcus circled the vehicle, his steps measured, his gaze briefly scanning the street, storefronts. Just opening, a man sweeping dust from a doorway, a woman adjusting a sign in a window, ordinary movements that felt grounded, real, and he held onto that for a second before opening the door and sliding into the seat, the interior smelling faintly of vinyl and old paper. The engine started with a low hum, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but structured, like a test that had not been announced. And Jake adjusted the rearview mirror, eyes flicking toward Marcus's reflection rather than the road. "You ever worked a place like this before?" he asked, casual on the surface, but with something underneath, something waiting. Marcus looked ahead, hands resting loosely on his thighs, posture relaxed but alert. "I have worked a lot of places," he replied, voice even. And that was all. No elaboration, no invitation, just enough to answer without giving anything away. Jake nodded slowly, as if filing that away, then shifted the car into drive, pulling out onto the street with a smooth motion, the tires rolling over a shallow crack in the pavement with a soft thud, and as they moved forward, the precinct faded behind them. But the feeling of it, the structure, the quiet lines of power and assumption, stayed with Marcus, clear and present, like a map he was already beginning to read. The patrol car slowed as it approached the address from dispatch, a narrow street lined with aging brick buildings and small storefronts that had seen better years, the kind of place where every sound carried a little farther than it should. And as Jake Collins pulled to the curb, the engine idling with a low, steady vibration, Marcus Reed's eyes moved instinctively across the scene, taking in details without appearing to search. A flickering sign above a convenience store, a delivery truck, double parked 20 feet ahead, a man standing near the entrance with his hands raised in a gesture that looked more defensive than aggressive, and a woman behind the glass door speaking rapidly to someone inside. "Noise complaint," Jake muttered, already unbuckling his seatbelt, his tone dismissive, as if the situation had already been decided before they stepped out, and Marcus followed a second later, closing the door quietly behind him, the click softer than the distant hum of traffic 2 blocks over. The air carried a mix of morning heat and the faint scent of gasoline, and as they approached, the man near the entrance turned slightly, his posture tightening, eyes moving from Jake to Marcus and then back again, uncertainty written in the small shifts of his stance. "Sir, we just need to talk," Marcus said, his voice calm, even, cutting through the tension without raising it, and the man's shoulders dropped just a fraction, enough to be noticed if someone was paying attention. Jake stepped forward beside him, his presence more rigid, more direct. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said, his words firm, clipped, but not loud, and the man nodded quickly, gesturing toward the door, explaining something about a misunderstanding, about a delivery that had gone wrong, his words overlapping, rushing, as if trying to get ahead of a conclusion already forming. Marcus listened without interrupting, his head tilting slightly, eyes steady, tracking the details, while Jake's gaze moved past the man, scanning the storefront with a practiced glance that seemed less about understanding and more about confirming. A brief silence settled, thin but noticeable, and Marcus spoke again. "Let us take a look inside. Make sure everything is settled." his tone measured, offering resolution rather than control, and for a moment, the space between all of them shifted, the tension easing just enough to allow movement. Inside, the store was narrow, shelves packed tight, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and a young employee stood behind the counter, hands resting on the edge as if unsure where to place them. The remains of a tipped-over display near the entrance suggesting the source of the call. Nothing broken, just displaced. Marcus stepped forward slowly, crouching just enough to straighten a fallen box, placing it back with care, not because it was necessary, but because it changed the rhythm of the room, grounding it, and he glanced up at the employee. "Looks like things got a little out of hand, but nothing serious," he said. And the employee nodded quickly, relief passing across his face like a shadow lifting. Behind him, Jake shifted his weight, arms crossing loosely, watching, not intervening, and for a second, his expression flickered, not approval, not disapproval, just something less certain than before. Marcus stood, brushing his hands lightly, and turned back toward the door. "We will note it as resolved," he said, more to the room than to any one person, and as they stepped back outside, the street felt different, quieter, as if something small but important had been reset. Jake paused by the car, keys in hand, studying Marcus for a moment longer than necessary, then gave a short nod, almost imperceptible. "You talk a lot for someone new," he said, but there was no edge to it this time, just observation. And Marcus met his gaze briefly, steady, composed. "I listened first," he replied, and then he opened the passenger door, the motion simple, controlled, leaving the rest unsaid as the engine started again and the car pulled back into the flow of the street. The patrol car rolled back into the precinct lot just after noon, the sunlight now sharper, casting hard reflections across the windshield as Jake Collins shifted the car into park with a quiet click, and for a moment neither of them moved, the engine idling low before he finally turned the key and the hum faded into silence, leaving only the distant echo of traffic and the faint buzz of overhead lines. Marcus Reed unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out first, the heat rising off the pavement in soft waves, his eyes adjusting as he glanced briefly toward the building. Its brick exterior worn but solid, a place that held more history than it showed. And as he walked toward the entrance, he noticed two officers standing near the door, their conversation pausing just long enough to track his approach before resuming in lower tones. Inside, the air felt cooler, conditioned, but the tension from earlier had not fully left. It had only settled deeper, like dust that had not yet been disturbed. And Marcus moved past the front desk where a stack of reports had grown since morning, the edges uneven, corners curling slightly, evidence of hands that had moved quickly but not carefully. "Reed," a voice called from across the room, sharper this time, and Marcus turned to see Sergeant Miller standing near the central desk, posture rigid, a file held loosely in one hand. "You handled that call," he said, not a question, but not quite approval either, and Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir." His tone steady, neutral, offering nothing beyond the fact. Miller stepped closer, placing the file down with a soft but deliberate tap. "You decided to take lead on a call your first day?" he continued, eyes narrowing slightly. "That is not how this place works." The words measured, controlled, but carrying weight, and around them, the room quieted just enough to listen without appearing to. Marcus held his ground, shoulders relaxed, hands at his sides. "I spoke to de-escalate," he replied, calm, precise. It resolved without further issue, and the silence that followed stretched a second longer than expected, the kind that made small sounds feel louder. A chair shifting, a pen clicking somewhere in the back. Jake stepped. And then, leaning casually against the edge of a desk, arms crossed. "He did fine," he said, voice lighter than Miller's, but still carrying. Situation was handled, and Miller's gaze flicked between them, weighing, calculating, before settling back on Marcus. "This is not about fine," he said, quieter now, but firmer. "This is about order," and he tapped the file once more. "You follow chain of command, or you create problems." The statement hanging in the air like a line drawn across the room. Marcus nodded slowly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. "Understood," he said, and his voice did not rise, did not push back. It simply landed, steady, and that steadiness seemed to unsettle more than defiance would have. For a moment, no one spoke, and then Miller turned away, picking up the file and walking toward his office, the door closing behind him with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have. The room exhaled, conversations picking back up, but quieter, more measured, and Jake glanced at Marcus again, something different in his expression now, less certain, less fixed. "You got a habit of stepping in like that?" he asked, not mocking, just curious, and Marcus looked toward the row of windows where sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long, narrow shadows across the floor. "Only when it matters," he replied, and he moved past him toward the report desk, picking up a pen and aligning the papers once more, his movements calm, deliberate, as if the lines of order he created on the page were the same ones he intended to bring into the room, even if no one else could see them yet. The station had quieted by the time the sun began to dip behind the buildings across the street, the light filtering through the blinds in long, narrow lines that stretched across the floor and up the legs of empty chairs, and Marcus Reed sat alone at the far end of the precinct, a single desk lamp casting a warm circle of light over the reports in front of him while the rest of the room faded into softer shadows. The earlier noise replaced by the low hum of ventilation and the occasional distant ring of a phone that no one rushed to answer. His jacket rested neatly over the back of his chair, the faint coffee stain still visible on the fabric, lighter now but not gone, and he glanced at it for a moment before returning his attention to the page, his pen moving steadily, each line of writing clean, measured, as if the act itself required precision beyond the words. Outside, a patrol car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping briefly across the windows before disappearing, leaving the room dim again, and Marcus leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under the shift of weight as he exhaled, slow and controlled, his gaze drifting toward the bulletin board across the room where the photos of past captains caught what little light remained, their expressions fixed, distant, watching over a place that no longer quite matched the order they represented. He stood after a moment, walking toward the window, his steps quiet, almost absorbed by the stillness, and he rested his hand lightly against the cool glass, looking out at the street below where a few late pedestrians moved with purpose, unaware of the layers of tension held within the walls above them. Behind him, the precinct remained unchanged on the surface, desks aligned, chairs pushed in, paperwork stacked in uneven piles that hinted at the day's activity. But Marcus could feel the weight beneath it all, the patterns that repeated, the subtle shifts in tone, the way voices carried differently depending on who was listening, and he closed his eyes briefly, not in fatigue, but in focus, gathering the pieces he had already seen, the small details others overlooked, the glances, the pauses, the choices made without being spoken. When he opened them again, his reflection stared back at him faintly in the glass, layered over the city lights beginning to flicker on outside, and for a second, the two images merged, the man inside the room and the one beyond it, both still, both waiting, and he adjusted his posture slightly, shoulders straightening, as if aligning himself with something larger than the moment. He returned to the desk, placing the pen down carefully, parallel to the edge of the paper, and reached for his jacket, his fingers brushing over the fabric where the stain remained, a quiet reminder of the morning, of the way the day had begun, and he did not try to remove it, did not hide it. He simply smoothed the surface once and slipped his arm through the sleeve, the motion calm, practiced, the clock on the wall ticked forward, each second marked clearly in the quiet, and Marcus stood there for a moment longer, the room holding its breath around him, before he turned toward the exit, the overhead lights dimming slightly as the evening cycle began, and as he stepped into the hallway, the sound of his footsteps steady and even, it felt less like leaving and more like preparing, as if everything that had happened so far was only the surface of something deeper that had yet to be revealed, something already in motion, waiting just beyond the reach of what anyone in that room believed they understood. The next morning arrived without announcement, the sky still pale as the first lights stretched across the precinct windows, and inside, the air carried that early stillness that only lasted a few minutes before routine took over, but today it did not settle the same way. Something in the room felt tighter, more contained, like a breath held too long. Marcus Reed stepped through the front doors with the same measured pace as the day before. His uniform pressed, the faint mark on his jacket still visible if someone looked close enough. And as he moved past the front desk, conversations that had just begun seemed to pause mid-sentence, not fully stopping, but shifting, lowering, adjusting around his presence in a way that had not been there before. Officer Jake Collins stood near the center of the room, a report in hand, speaking to two others, but his voice faded as his eyes caught Marcus entering, and for a brief second, there was something different in his expression, not confidence, not amusement, something less certain, like a question he had not yet formed. Sergeant Miller emerged from his office at the same time, a folder tucked under his arm, his posture rigid as always, but his steps slower today, more deliberate, and he scanned the room once before his gaze settled on Marcus, holding there a moment longer than necessary before he spoke. "Everyone, gather up," his voice firm, carrying easily across the space, and chairs shifted, papers were set down, conversations cut short as officers moved toward the center, forming a loose circle that felt both routine and unfamiliar at once. Marcus took his place at the edge of the group, neither stepping forward nor holding back, his stance relaxed, eyes steady, and he noticed the way a few glances flicked toward him, then away, as if people were trying to place something that did not fit the pattern they expected. Miller cleared his throat, opening the folder with a crisp motion. "We have an update regarding command structure," he began, and the words landed with a subtle weight, enough to draw full attention, enough to quiet even the smallest movements in the room, and Jake shifted slightly, uncrossing his arms, his posture straightening just a fraction as if instinctively preparing. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, filling the silence between sentences, and Miller continued. "Effective immediately, there will be a change in leadership for this precinct." And the room stilled completely now, no shifting, no murmurs, just a collective pause, the kind that stretched time thin. Marcus did not move, did not react. His breathing steady, his gaze calm, but something in the air around him felt anchored, grounded, like a center point that had always been there even when no one recognized it. Miller closed the folder halfway, his eyes lifting from the page and scanning the group once more before settling forward. "Your new captain has already been assigned," he said, each word deliberate, measured, and a faint ripple moved through the room, not loud, not spoken, but present in the way shoulders adjusted, in the way attention sharpened, in the way expectations formed in silence. Jake's eyes flicked briefly toward the doorway, then back to Miller, then across the room as if searching for someone who had not yet entered, his jaw tightening slightly, and Marcus remained still, hands at his sides, posture unchanged, but the light from the windows caught the edge of his badge, reflecting a sharper gleam than before, something small but unmistakable. Miller took one step back, creating space at the front of the group, his voice lowering just enough to mark the moment. "Captain Reed," he said, and the name settled into the room like a final note, clear, undeniable, and for a second, no one moved, no one spoke, because the shift was not just in the words, but in the realization that followed, slow and heavy, as every glance turned, every assumption recalculated. And Marcus Reed stepped forward into that space with the same calm he had carried all along, the silence around him no longer questioning, but answering. No one moved at first, not because they did not understand, but because understanding arrived too quickly, too completely, leaving no room for denial. And the room that had once felt loud with small judgments now stood in a silence that pressed against every surface, every desk, every breath. Marcus Reed stepped forward into the space Sergeant Miller had cleared, his posture unchanged, shoulders relaxed, chin level, his presence neither raised nor diminished by the title that had just been spoken, and the light from the overhead fixtures settled evenly across his uniform, catching the edge of his badge in a quiet, steady reflection that did not demand attention but held it anyway. Jake Collins remained where he stood, arms no longer crossed, hands now resting at his sides as if unsure where to place them. His eyes fixed on Marcus with a stillness that replaced the confidence he had carried the day before, and, for a brief second, his gaze dropped, not fully, just enough to break the line he had once held so easily. Sergeant Miller shifted his weight, stepping back another half step, his role in the moment complete. But his expression tightened slightly, the structure he had enforced now standing in a different alignment than before, one he had not controlled. Marcus let the silence settle, not rushing to fill it, not forcing words into a space that needed to feel the shift first, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, even, carrying across the room without effort. "We are going to do things by the book," he said, each word clear, measured. "Not because it is easier, but because it is right." And the statement landed without accusation, without reference to the moments that had come before, yet it held them all within it, quietly, undeniably. A few officers shifted their stance, subtle adjustments, the kind that came from recognition rather than instruction, and Marcus's eyes moved across the room, not lingering on any one person, but acknowledging all of them equally, as if the lines that had once divided the space no longer held the same meaning. He took another step forward, placing a folder on the central desk with a soft, controlled motion, the sound barely louder than the hum of the lights, and he opened it, revealing a set of printed reports, neatly aligned, each page marked with careful notes, observations recorded not in haste, but with intention. "Every call, every report, every interaction," he continued, "is a reflection of who we are in this room." His tone steady, not raised, but carrying a weight that did not need volume. And for a moment, the room seemed to lean in, not physically, but in attention, in the way focus sharpened without being asked. Jake's gaze returned to Marcus. Steadier now, but different, the edges of certainty replaced by something closer to awareness, and he gave a small nod, almost involuntary, as if acknowledging a truth that had been present all along, but had not been recognized until now. Marcus closed the folder gently, aligning it with the edge of the desk, his movements precise, controlled, and he stepped back just enough to create space again, not separating himself, but allowing the room to breathe, to adjust, to settle into the new shape it had taken. No one spoke immediately, no one challenged, no one filled the silence with noise, because there was nothing left to prove in that moment, only something to understand. And as the seconds passed, the tension that had once defined the space did not disappear, but it changed, softened at the edges, reshaped into something quieter, something more deliberate, like a system being reset without a single word needing to announce it. The room did not return to what it had been, not immediately, not fully, because something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, and even as chairs moved and papers were picked up again, the rhythm felt different, quieter, more deliberate, like every action now carried an awareness that had not existed the day before. Marcus Reed stood near the front of the precinct, not elevated, not separated, but positioned in a way that naturally drew the space into alignment, his presence steady, grounded, and he did not need to speak again for the weight of his earlier words to remain, settling into the room like a structure that could not be easily undone. Jake Collins moved first, a small step forward, then another, his boots no longer echoing with the same certainty, and he stopped a few feet from Marcus, his posture straight but no longer rigid, his eyes meeting Marcus's without challenge, without avoidance. And for a moment, the silence between them carried more meaning than anything that could be said. "Captain," Jake said finally, the word measured, unfamiliar on his tongue, but clear, and it landed in the space between them not as submission, but as recognition. And Marcus gave a slight nod, not as approval, not as dismissal, but as acknowledgement, the exchange simple, contained, complete. Across the room, Sergeant Miller adjusted the stack of files on his desk, aligning the edges with a precision that mirrored the shift in atmosphere, his movements controlled, his gaze focused on the work in front of him, but the tension that had once defined his presence had softened, replaced by something quieter, more reflective. The fluorescent lights above continued their steady hum, but now it blended into the background, no longer sharp, no longer intrusive, and the precinct itself seemed to settle into a new balance. The earlier weight replaced by a different kind of stillness, one that held possibility rather than pressure. Marcus turned slightly, his eyes moving toward the row of windows where the afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting long, even lines across the floor, and he took a slow breath, the air steady, measured, carrying the faint scent of paper and polished metal, familiar, grounding. He stepped toward the central desk, placing his hand lightly against its surface, feeling the coolness beneath his palm, and for a moment, he remained there, not thinking, not reacting, just present, as if allowing the space to settle fully into what it had become. Behind him, the room continued to move, but differently now. Conversations quieter, more direct, actions more intentional, and no one needed to announce the change because it was already there, visible in the smallest details, in the way voices no longer carried the same edge, in the way glances no longer avoided or measured, but met and passed without weight. Marcus reached up briefly, adjusting the collar of his uniform, smoothing the fabric where the faint marks still remained, not erased, not hidden, just part of what had been, and he let his hand fall back to his side, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. Outside, a patrol car passed by, its reflection sliding across the glass in a slow, steady line before fading, and the light it left behind settled softly across the badge on Marcus's chest, catching just enough to reflect. Not bright, not sharp, but constant. No one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the moment did not need it. And in that quiet, the precinct held a different kind of order, one built not on assumption, but on understanding, and Marcus Reed stood within it, not above it, not apart from it, but at its center, where the noise had finally given way to something stronger, something steady, something that did not need to be announced to be known.